The note said, "Wear something you wouldn't normally wear." And so Alara Shaw stood in front of her bathroom mirror in a dress the color of a bruise, wondering when exactly she had agreed to any of this. She hadn't. That was the thing. She had not agreed. She had been worn down, which was an entirely different phenomenon. A slow erosion, like the kind she studied professionally. The way water didn't break stone all at once, but returned and returned and returned until the stone simply had no argument left. Her friends were very good at being water. If you've ever been pushed into something terrifying and found something beautiful on the other side, you're going to want to stay for this one. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's see where this night takes Alara. The dress had been Margot's idea, which tracked because everything catastrophic in Alara's life had been Margot's idea at some stage. Margot Voss, textile artist, maker of excellent pasta, and the single most persuasive human being Alara had ever encountered, had appeared at her workshop 3 days ago, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, a look of determined compassion, and a printed card with the words, "The Violet Room, Friday, 9 p.m. in embossed ink that felt aggressively expensive between Alara's glue-stained fingers. "Absolutely not," Alara had said, which was how she knew the conversation was already over. She had set down the card and picked up her bone folder. Returning to the spine, she was reattaching to a 1904 edition of The Golden Bowl, a novel about people making terrible decisions for beautiful reasons, which, in retrospect, should have felt like a warning. She had pressed the bone folder along the new cloth hinge with the steadiness that only came from years of practice, from learning that too much pressure and you crack what you're trying to mend, and too little pressure, and nothing holds. Margot had pulled up a stool and sat down, and said nothing for a full 6 minutes, which was how Alara knew she was serious. "It's not a big deal," Margot had said finally. "Everything you frame as not a big deal is always exactly that. Her name is on the card." Alara had looked. Below the venue name, in smaller print, "Ask for Diana." "I don't know anyone named Diana." "You will. That's the point." "Margot." "Alara." Margot had said her name with a softness that was somehow worse than urgency. "You haven't been out, since the thing with Camille. We agreed we weren't calling it the thing with Camille. We agreed you weren't calling it that. I reserve the right." Margot had reached across the work table and put one hand over Alara's, carefully avoiding the wet adhesive, which was a gesture of practiced intimacy. "It's been 14 months. I'm aware of how many months it's been. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to seal yourself into a book." Alara had almost smiled at that. Almost. "I work with books. You live inside them. There's a difference." Margot had taken her coffee back and looked around the workshop. The floor-to-ceiling shelves, the angled light table, the rows of pressing boards and weights, the jars of paste and Japanese tissue and wheat starch, the whole ordered world that Alara had built for herself between 800 square feet of pre-war Manhattan. "You're 31 years old. You're brilliant and you're funny when you want to be, and you have a face that people write songs about, and you spend every night in here with your dead books." "My books are not dead. I'm keeping them alive. That is literally my job. Go to the date." "I don't go." Margot had stood, picked up her bag, and put the card on top of the Henry James. "I already told Diana you'd be there." The betrayal of that had taken a moment to land. Margot, you told her." But Margot had already been at the door, pulling on her coat, performing the particular kind of exit that left no room for reversal. "Wear something you wouldn't normally wear, and for the love of God, wash the paste off your hands first." The paste was off her hands. That was about the only part of this that was going according to plan. Alara stood on the sidewalk outside a building that looked, from the outside, like exactly nothing. A door set between two darkened gallery windows in a block of Soho that smelled like October and someone else's expensive perfume. There was no sign. There was a small, illuminated violet circle above the door's frame, the kind of detail you only noticed if you already knew to look for it, and a man outside who looked like he'd been carved specifically to be standing there, saying nothing, with his hands folded behind his back. She had the card in her hand. She'd looked at the name again in the cab, held the card under the small reading light like she held pages she was trying to date, looking for the grain of the paper, the quality of the ink, the way the letters sat on the surface. Diana. A name with gravity to it. A name like a planet. She told herself she wasn't nervous. She was extremely nervous. The man at the door looked at her card and then at her, and something in his expression shifted fractionally. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. He opened the door. The staircase went down. Here is what Alara would later remember about first entering the Violet Room, that it was less a place than a change in pressure, like descending into something rather than arriving somewhere. The stairs were bare concrete with iron railings, entirely unadorned, which only made the contrast more startling, because at the bottom, the door opened, and the world rearranged itself. The space had been, at some earlier point, a warehouse basement. You could still feel that, in the height of the ceiling and the rawness of the brick, but everything else had been transformed by someone with strong opinions and excellent taste. The lighting was violet and gold, not garish, not theatrical, but layered, like the light was something you moved through rather than something that was simply there. The bar ran the entire length of one wall, shelves behind it stacked with bottles that caught the light like relics. Low velvet seating and deep jewel tones clustered around small circular tables. And the sound, a bassist and a pianist doing something that was jazz in the way that a cathedral is architecture, technically correct but aiming at something beyond the category. It was, Alara thought, genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful. It was also extremely full of people, none of whom she knew, all of whom seemed to belong here, in a way she fundamentally did not. She stood at the bottom of the staircase with her card, and her bruise-colored dress, and her hands, which felt unbearably empty without something to hold, and she scanned the room for someone who might be named Diana. She had, she realized, no further information than that. She didn't know what Diana looked like, didn't know where she'd be sitting, didn't know anything except a first name and a venue, and the fact that Margot had set this up, which meant one of two things. Either Diana was someone extraordinary, or this was going to make an excellent story to tell against herself for years. Alara had always been better at stories than at events. She made her way to the bar, because the bar was a goal, and goals were helpful, and ordered something she recognized, a gin gimlet, which was the drink equivalent of a controlled experiment. Then she turned around and looked at the room with the careful, methodical attention she brought to everything, the same way she'd approach a damaged text. What do I actually have here? What's original and what's been added later? What's been obscured that needs to be recovered? That was when she saw the woman. She was not looking for Alara. That was the first thing. She was turned slightly toward the bar with one elbow on its surface, and she was looking at something in her glass with the focused, abstracted expression of a person whose mind was in an entirely different room. She held the glass, something amber, no ice, by the rim rather than the base, which was a small, odd detail that Alara's eyes snagged on without knowing why. The woman was dressed the way certain people are dressed, not in clothes, but as something. A suit jacket in charcoal gray with the collar open beneath it, just barely. The kind of deliberate informality that costs more than formality does. Dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless and probably took someone else's labor. A jaw that was doing a lot of work in this dim light. She was, to put it plainly, extraordinary looking. Alara looked away immediately, which was the reflexive, self-preserving thing to do, and looked back at her card, and looked at the card for a full beat longer than was necessary, and then looked back at the woman, because the room was not that large, and the woman had somehow become the only thing in it that had any weight. The woman looked up from her glass. Their eyes met. There was a moment, and Alara would spend considerable time afterward trying to decide whether it was 2 seconds or 10, in which neither of them looked away. It was the woman who made the choice to end it, tilting her head with a fraction of consideration, like she was revising something. Then she looked back at her drink. Alara gripped her card harder and thought, I am going to kill Margot Voss. She spent 20 minutes finding her way to Diana, who turned out to be a perfectly pleasant event coordinator named Diana Reyes, who had been seated in a corner booth with a glass of sparkling water and a warm, professional smile that immediately clarified several things. First, that Margot had not arranged a romantic blind date in the traditional sense. Second, that the Violet Room operated a kind of curated social experience, a structured evening for a small group of people selected for compatibility, and then left to find each other organically, guided loosely by staff. Third, and most importantly, the name on Alara's card was not Diana's name. Diana was the host. The date's name was on the back of the card, in smaller print, that Alara had not thought to look at in the cab, because she'd assumed the name she could read was the name she needed. She flipped the card over in Diana's booth. S.C. S.C., Alara said. She should be here already, Diana said. She usually arrives early. Likes to have the room oriented before her guests. She said it with a hint of something. Not quite amusement, but the knowing quality of someone who had catalogued a habit. What does she look like? Diana glanced toward the bar. You'll know her when you see her. Alara knew her when she saw her. Because of course. Because the universe, when it is building toward something, has very little interest in subtlety. The woman with the charcoal jacket and the amber drink and the jaw that was doing too much was still at the bar, still looking at something in her glass. And Alara stood 5 feet away from her and understood with the specific terrible clarity of someone who has very good pattern recognition that this was either her date or the setup for a story she was never going to stop telling. She touched the card again, looked at the back. S.C. Sloane, she would later learn. The S was for Sloane, but that came later. Right now, Alara walked up to the bar. She ordered nothing because her gimlet was still in her other hand, mostly untouched. She stood beside the woman with 2 feet of space between them, which was the polite distance, and then said, to the middle distance, rather than to the woman directly, I'm looking for someone. The woman didn't look up from her glass. Most people here are. Her voice was... It did something to the room. It didn't raise itself to be heard above the piano. It simply was, and the other sounds arranged themselves around it. Low and precise, with a texture like the first page of a book you know is going to be worth it. Alara turned to look at her properly. I think that someone might be you. Now the woman looked up. Up close, the details rearranged themselves. She was older than she'd looked from across the room. Not by much, maybe 5 or 6 years. Enough to mean something. There were faint lines at the corners of eyes that were a gray so pale they were almost silver, and there was in them an intelligence that had the particular quality of being both comprehensive and contained, like it was accounting for everything and choosing, carefully, what to respond to. One eyebrow went up. A fraction. The glass paused on the way to her lips. Are you my date? Alara asked. The woman looked at her, fully, without hurry, in a way that felt less like being looked at, and more like being read. The way Alara read old pages, trying to understand what the thing had been before it became what it was now. Then the woman set her drink on the bar, took a slow breath through her nose, and said, I'm exactly who you need me to be tonight. And she picked up her glass and drank. Here is the thing about a sentence like that. It shouldn't work. By any reasonable metric, it is too smooth, too precisely constructed, too aware of its own effect. It is the kind of line that should produce an eye roll, or at least the recognition of theater. Ilara, who was a person of reasonable metrics and had spent 14 months very deliberately not being moved by things, felt it land in the center of her chest like a key turning. She ordered another drink. The woman beside her, SC. Sloane, the woman who was exactly who she needed, didn't fill the silence that followed, which was the first genuinely surprising thing. Every other person Ilara had met in this building was performing some version of ease, that particular Manhattan sociability that looked like confidence and was mostly practiced velocity. This woman was simply still, present in a way that wasn't passive but chosen. "I'm Ilara said. "I know," said the woman. "A beat. You know. Diana introduced us before you arrived." The faintest curve at one corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. "I'm better with faces than with being formal about it. I should have introduced myself. You just did." The bartender set a fresh gimlet in front of Ilara, and the woman, still unnamed, still occupying that corner of Ilara's attention that kept insisting on being a corner, looked at it with something like recognition. "Gin gimlet," she said. "Standard measurement," Ilara said. "I like to know what I'm dealing with." "Is that a philosophy?" "It's a preference." The woman finally turned toward her properly, shifting her weight against the bar with the unhurried ease of someone who had never needed to establish comfort in a room because the room had always arranged itself around her. She extended her hand. "Sloane," she said. Her hand was cooler than expected, and her grip was confident without being declarative about it. 3 seconds, and she let go. Ilara felt the absence of the grip like the end of a sentence. "Sloane," Ilara repeated, testing the word. "Say it like you mean it. I just met you. Meaning doesn't require duration." Sloane picked up her drink again. "What do you do, Ilara?" And here, normally, was where the evening's real texture began. That polite exchange of professional identities, the ritual in which people tried to assess each other's weight by the shape of their work. Ilara had been through it enough times to know how it went. She said, "Book restoration," and people said, "Oh, like libraries?" And she said, "More like surgery." And people either got it or they didn't, and you could tell everything from which. She said, "I restore old books." Sloane looked at her hands. Not quickly, not invasively, a single deliberate glance downward and back up, like a measurement taken. "What kind of old books?" "The damaged kind. First editions. Manuscripts. Anything someone has decided is worth keeping." "And you decide that? Whether something is worth keeping?" "No," Ilara said. "The history decides. I just figure out how to hold it together." Sloane was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, the piano behind them resolved a phrase and started another, something with more patience in it. "I work in preservation too," Sloane said. "Really? Of a kind." She drank. "I find things that are underperforming, and I determine what they're worth and what it would take to make them worth more." That sounds like the opposite of preservation. Does it? Preservation is about keeping something as close to its original state as possible. What you're describing sounds more like... Ilara paused, choosing. "Renovation. Or evolution," Sloane said, "depending on your perspective." "Spoken like someone with a plan?" Sloane looked at her then, with an attention that had sharpened, and Ilara had the brief, vertiginous sensation of having said something true without meaning to. "Spoken like someone who pays attention," Sloane said. It went on like that. That's the only way to describe what happened in the 90 minutes that followed. It went on like that, meaning it continued in the same register of unlikely rightness. The conversation building on itself the way a good melody builds. Not by straying far from the theme, but by finding all the variations inside it, They talked about preservation. It was, technically, the subject, Ilara's understanding of it, and Sloane's, which turned out to be almost perfectly opposed in their approach and almost perfectly aligned in their underlying conviction, which was that certain things deserved to survive. They just disagreed, sharply and with increasing interest, on how survival worked. Ilara believed in keeping things intact, in the minimum intervention necessary, in the ethics of leaving something as close to what it had been as you could manage, because the original intent mattered even when the original maker was gone, because a thing was not just what it was also everything that had happened to it, and that accumulation had value. Sloane believed that the only real preservation was use, that a thing locked in a case or a vault or a workshop wasn't being saved. It was being held hostage by sentiment. That the buildings and artifacts and documents that survived were the ones that were given new reasons to exist, new functions, new people to need them. "You're describing gentrification," Ilara said at some point, with a directness she wouldn't have managed an hour ago, and that surprised her as it left her mouth. Sloane didn't flinch. "I'm describing survival. They're not mutually exclusive." "No, but sometimes they're not the same thing either." Sloane swirled her drink. "What would you rather? A building that changes to house something living, or a building kept exactly as it was for people who come to look at it?" "That's a false choice." "Most real choices are false, at the construction level. You still have to make them." Ilara looked at her. "What do you actually do?" she asked. "Specifically." Something moved across Sloane's face. A fast thing, gone before Ilara could name it. Not discomfort, exactly. More like the brief surface tension of a thing being decided against. "Real estate," she said. "Investment, acquisition." She said it flatly, with a precision that had none of the elaboration she'd brought to everything else. It was a closed door where everything else had been open hallways, and Ilara, who knew closed doors, let it be. "Tell me about the worst thing you've ever had to restore," Sloane said. And the door, in its way, swung shut and locked. "A book of hours," Ilara said, "from the late 14th century. Someone had rebound it 3 times, each time badly. The original boards were gone. The sewing structure was completely compromised. They just glued everything in place at some point, probably in the 19th century, which is almost worse than letting it fall apart naturally. And the vellum had been water damaged and then dried without humidification, so it had this..." She stopped, noticing that her hands had begun to move. She was illustrating in the air, which was a habit she thought she'd controlled. "It had this curl, like every page was trying to close itself, turn back into an animal." Sloane was watching her hands. "And?" she said. "And I spent 4 months on it. I had to humidify each page individually under tension, with weights. I had to research the original binding structure from comparable manuscripts. I had to make a new board from materials that matched the period as closely as possible." She paused. "I had to reverse 40 years of someone else's bad decisions before I could even begin to figure out what was original." "Did you?" "Eventually." "What did you find?" Ilara was quiet for a moment, remembering. The workshop had been cold that March, and she had worked with her hands covered by thin cotton gloves, and the light table had hummed its low mechanical hum, and the pages had finally opened. "Marginalia," she said. "Someone, maybe the original owner, maybe a later reader, had written in the margins, in a very small, very careful hand. Not prayers, not annotations." She looked at her drink. "Stories. Tiny stories, maybe 3 or 4 lines each, filling the borders around the illuminations, about ordinary things. A thunderstorm, a dog that kept getting into the kitchen, a neighbor who sang too loudly. A medieval person complaining about their neighbor's singing," Sloane said. In the margins of a book of hours, yes. Elara smiled. It was, she registered distantly, the first real smile of the evening. The kind that arrived before you knew it was coming. The kind that meant something. Someone sat with that book, probably in a scriptorium or a private chapel, probably in the cold, and they wrote down everything the book wasn't supposed to be about. Everything ordinary and specific and theirs. And that's what you found. That's what would have been destroyed. If the book had been lost, or if someone had kept restoring it badly, or if no one had thought it was worth the time. She looked up at Sloane. That's why it matters. Not the illuminations, not the historical record, a person's handwriting in the margins about a dog getting into the kitchen. Sloane was looking at her with the same undivided attention as before, but something in it had shifted. Not softened exactly, but deepened. As if the assessment she'd been conducting had arrived at a conclusion she hadn't quite expected. How do you decide? Sloane asked. Which things deserve the work? I told you. The history. No, not professionally. She set her glass down. How do you decide? What makes you say yes to something broken? Elara looked at her, thought about it honestly, because Sloane was asking honestly, and because dishonesty in response to that felt like a betrayal of something. I ask whether there's something true inside it, she said. Something original that hasn't been completely destroyed. Whether there's enough of the first intent left to be worth the work of recovering it. She paused. And sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes you open something up expecting to find the original and it's just damage all the way through. But you don't know until you try. Sloane was quiet for a long moment. The pianist finished a phrase. Somewhere across the room, someone laughed at something, and the laugh had a brightness to it that lit the whole room for a half second. I ask myself something similar, Sloane said, quietly. Elara waited. Whether there's a structure inside the damage worth building from. She looked at the amber in her glass. Whether what's broken was something real to begin with. The sentence sat between them with a weight that felt biographical rather than abstract. Elara didn't ask, but she wanted to. At some point. And she couldn't have said exactly when, because time in the violet room had a different quality than it did above ground, elastic, and slightly untrustworthy. They had moved from the bar to a small table in a corner alcove. She didn't remember deciding to move, too. She remembered Sloane tilting her head in the direction of the table and herself following, which was not how she usually behaved, but which felt at the time like the logical continuation of something already in progress. There was a candle on the table. Small, set in a violet glass, so the flame looked purple. Elara had the thought, unbidden, that she was going to have to be very careful. You haven't asked me anything personal, Sloane said. She was leaning slightly forward, elbows on the table, which was the first uncomposed posture she'd adopted all evening, and it made her look, not softer exactly, but more present, less curated. I've asked you plenty of things. About work, about philosophy. A hint of something wry at the edge of her voice. Nothing about who I am. I've learned who you are, Elara said. From the other things. One eyebrow. Have you? You're someone who thinks in structures. You lead with frameworks, and then occasionally, when something surprising comes through, you let yourself respond to it directly. You're not comfortable being surprised. Elara paused. And you're used to knowing more about a situation than the other people in it. Sloane looked at her for a long moment. That's more accurate than I'd like, she said. Do you want me to be wrong? I want to know how you did it. I pay attention, Elara said. Occupational hazard. You look at things carefully enough, long enough. The structure becomes visible. She picked up her drink. That's all restoration is, really. Learning to see through the damage to what was underneath. What do you see underneath me? The question arrived without preparation, without the armor of irony she'd heard in everything else Sloane had said, and Alara felt it as a genuine thing offered, which meant it required a genuine thing returned. Something careful, she said slowly. Something that has practiced being hard because hard things last longer. She looked at Sloane's hands, those hands on the table, which were expressive in stillness, the way hands belonging to people who work with them tend to be. And something that doesn't get to have conversations like this very often. Sloane's jaw shifted. A micro-expression, over quickly, that Alara couldn't name with precision, but recognized in category. The way a person looks when something true has landed. No, Sloane said quietly. I don't. And that was the turn. Not dramatic, not accompanied by music swelling or light shifting. Just a sentence, simply delivered, with a transparency in it that changed the entire architecture of the evening. Around midnight, they ordered food. Small plates arrived that neither of them fully attended to, their presence on the table mostly a social formality, something to gesture at. Alara ate 3 bites of something with smoked cheese and decided it was excellent, and then immediately forgot about it. She found out, in the way you find things out when you are not asking directly, but simply talking, that Sloane was an only child, that she had grown up in Manhattan. Not in it, exactly, but of it, in the way only certain people who have always had resources are, meaning she knew the city comprehensively, but had rarely needed it as a stranger needs it, as a problem to be solved. That she had gone to Columbia and then to London for a year, that she described only as instructive, with a brevity that suggested it had been anything but simple. That she ran her family's company now, Sterling Investments, which Alara had vaguely heard of in the way you hear of things that live in a different register of the city's life. The financial register, the skyline register, the kind of wealth that is not new enough to be interesting news anymore. She found out that Sloane read, not broadly, but with specificity. She had opinions about which translation of Anna Karenina was the only defensible one and why. And she had read the same Shirley Jackson novel 3 times. And she had a habit of annotating books she loved in pencil, which she mentioned offhandedly, and then seemed briefly self-conscious about, as if she'd admitted something more personal than intended. I annotate in pencil too, Alara said. Really? Of course. You can always erase pencil. It's reversible. She tilted her head. I'm professionally obligated to be reversible. It's one of the core ethics of conservation. You only use materials and methods that can be undone if necessary. So future people have options. Sloane was quiet for a moment, and there was in that quiet something that felt almost wistful. That's a better principle than most things run on, she said. Relationships especially, Alara said, and then heard herself and thought, where did that come from? Sloane looked at her, not surprised, but attending to it. Tell me about the last relationship, Sloane said. That's the personal question. We've been talking for 3 hours. I think we've earned a personal question. Alara looked at the candle. Her name was Camille. She was a photographer. We were together for 2 years. She paused. She left for Paris. Not for me. I mean, she didn't leave me for Paris. She left, yes, for a residency, which is a reasonable thing to do. Except she'd already decided to leave before she told me about the residency, and I found that out afterward. And that was the part that was the damage. Not the leaving. The deciding alone. Alara looked up. I could have handled the leaving. I've handled leaving before. But I found out, after, that she'd known for 4 months. That she'd been deciding for 4 months while I was still... She stopped. Still trusting the structure. Sloane was listening with her whole body. I'm sorry, she said. Simply, with no decoration on it. I'm not, Alara said, and found that she meant it. Or I was. Now I think I'm on the other side of it, which is why I'm here, ostensibly. My friend Margot decided I needed to be somewhere other than my workshop. Was she right? Alara looked at her, at the light through the violet glass touching the planes of Sloane's face, at the pianist still playing something patient and low-lit across the room, at the whole impossible specificity of this particular evening, in this particular place, with this particular person. I'm going to tell her she was, Alara said. Yes. Sloane's mouth curved. Not the fractional, controlled thing from earlier, but more. Enough to show that there were possibilities in her face that she was not always extending, that this was a gift. Alara felt the evening shift in her chest. A different kind of pressure, the kind that meant something was changing. You never asked me, Sloane said. They were on their third drinks. The room had thinned somewhat. It was past midnight now, and some tables had cleared, and the space had a different quality, quieter, more intimate. The pianist now playing solo, something that had no discernible melody, but made complete sense anyway. Asked you what? The personal question. Sloane turned her glass on the table, a small rotation, precisely centered. You told me about Camille. I haven't told you anything equivalent. I didn't ask. Why not? Alara considered this. Because I thought you'd tell me when you wanted to, she said. I don't think you're someone who responds well to being asked directly. A pause. Most people push, Sloane said. I know, it's annoying. Something that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but adjacent to it. A sound in the chest, rather than fully out in the air. The kind of laugh that surprises the person making it. I haven't been in a relationship in 3 years, Sloane said. To the table, not quite to Alara. I've dated. I've been present in various situations. But nothing with the structure of... She stopped, started again. I work all the time. I make that choice. It's not that I'm not capable of... Another stop, and this one felt like something she was navigating around rather than toward. My mother used to say I was very good at acquiring things and very bad at keeping them. That sounds unkind. It sounds accurate. She looked up. I don't say it with self-pity. I've chosen the work. I'm good at the work. The work matters. A pause. I just sometimes wonder what the annotation in the margin is. The part that's mine and not the project. Alara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. The dog getting into the kitchen, she said. Sloane looked at her. The small, ordinary, true thing, Alara said, in the margins of everything important. They held that for a moment. The candle threw moving light across the table. Yes, Sloane said quietly, that. The evening ended without ending, which is how some evenings go. They were still talking at 1:30, and at some point Diana had stopped by to check on them with a look that contained professional satisfaction and something warmer. And Alara had barely registered her visit because she was in the middle of explaining the difference between Japanese and European tissue paper in terms of fiber structure, and had become genuinely animated about it, which was embarrassing in retrospect, except that Sloane had been leaning forward with her chin on one hand, actually listening, asking actual questions. At 1:47, she would later know this because she checked her phone for the first time in hours and felt a brief shock at the number. Alara said, I should probably find out how to get home. Sloane looked at her for a long moment. I have a car, she said. If you need. I live in the East Village. I know Manhattan. They were both very still for a moment. Sloane, Alara started. I know, Sloane said, and then, with a deliberateness that was not quite casual, it doesn't have to be anything other than what it is. Alara looked at her. At the question in that statement, and the answer she was asking Alara to supply. And what is it? She asked. An evening, Sloane said, that neither of us expected. The room was quiet. The pianist had stopped. Somewhere in the distance, a glass clinked, and someone laughed softly at something private, and the candle between them was very low now, the light smaller, warmer, closer. Ilara picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "Okay," she said. The city at nearly 2 a.m. in October is a different city than the one that exists in daylight. Not asleep, but interior, folded inward, its noise rearranged into something lower and more personal. The car was black and quiet, and moved through the empty streets with a smoothness that made the whole thing feel like a parenthesis, something inserted between two ordinary sentences. They didn't talk much, which after 3 hours of talking felt not like silence but like a different kind of communication, more comfortable, more honest. Sloane sat with her arm against the window and looked out at the streets, and Ilara sat with her hands in her lap and looked mostly forward and occasionally at Sloane's profile, the line of her nose, the way the city light moved across her cheekbone like a tide. At some point Sloane turned and found Ilara looking and didn't say anything about it. At some point the car stopped somewhere that was not the East Village, and Ilara understood, with a clarity that had nothing anxious in it, that neither of them had actually given any address. The apartment was on the 42nd floor, and the skyline was through the glass like an argument for the world being worth it. All those lights, all those people living their lives in all those windows. The whole impossible geometry of the island laid out below, like something someone had designed specifically to be seen from a height. Ilara stood at the window with her hands pressed to the glass and looked down at the city she'd lived in for 8 years and had never once seen from up here. "Is it yours?" she asked. "The view?" "The apartment." "Yes." She turned around. Sloane was standing in the middle of the room, jacket off now, and looking at her with an expression that had none of the control of earlier. Or rather, all of the control was still there, but it was no longer being deployed against anything. It was just how she looked when she wasn't managing anything. It was the most beautiful thing Ilara had seen all evening, and she had seen a great deal of beautiful things. "You should know," Sloane said, "that I almost didn't come tonight." "To the Violet Room?" "Yes." "Why did you?" "A beat." "I don't know," Sloane said. "Something uncharacteristic." Ilara thought about the 14 months she'd spent in her workshop, in her careful, controlled, reversible life, about Margot standing at the door with a printed card and a kind of love that expressed itself in the form of interference, about the note on top of the Henry James, "Wear something you wouldn't normally wear." "I think sometimes," Ilara said, "uncharacteristic is the most true thing there is." Sloane crossed the room. She didn't touch her immediately. She stood close enough that Ilara could feel the warmth of her, and looked at her in the same way she had at the bar, but without anything held back now, and Ilara looked back, and it was a lot to be looked at like that. It was almost too much, but she didn't look away. "Can I?" Sloane asked, and Ilara, who had spent 14 months inside a controlled and careful world of her own making, who had spent an entire evening talking about the ethics of preservation and the importance of reversibility, who was a person of frameworks and methods and measured interventions, said yes. The city went on below, indifferent and shining. The candles on the window ledge threw small doubled lights against the glass. Reflections layered over the skyline until the building lights and the flame lights were impossible to separate. Later, in the specific intimacy of aftermath, they lay side by side without the necessity of filling the dark with language. The skyline was still there through the floor-to-ceiling glass, changed in quality now. Not a prospect, but a companion, something that had been there for all of it. Ilara looked at the ceiling. Sloane lay with one arm behind her head, looking at the same ceiling, and there was a version of peace in the room that felt genuinely new, like she'd arrived somewhere she hadn't known she was trying to get to. "The annotation in the margin," Sloane said, quietly, to the ceiling. Ilara turned her head. Sloane didn't elaborate. but the corners of her eyes had softened into something real, something unguarded, and Alara thought, yes, this. The small, true, ordinary thing. She turned back to the ceiling. She thought she should probably be measuring this, noting the fragility of it, the variables she didn't control. She thought about what Margot would say. She thought about the bruise-colored dress now folded over a stranger's chair, and how it wasn't quite the color of a bruise anymore, in her mind, but something else. A dark bloom, a gathered light. She fell asleep with the city still burning below her, golden and indifferent, and endlessly, improbably alive. Morning came at her sideways through the glass. The specific steel gray of a New York October dawn. The light not so much arriving as being admitted, the way light comes into very tall rooms. Alara woke by degrees, the way she usually didn't, the consciousness arriving in layers instead of all at once. She reached for the glasses she always kept on the nightstand and found nothing. She wasn't on her nightstand. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was the wrong ceiling. Not wrong in a bad way. Just definitively, specifically, architecturally different from the ceiling she fell asleep beneath on ordinary nights. Higher. Darker in color. A light fixture she didn't recognize. She sat up. The room was quiet. The other side of the bed was empty, and empty in a way that suggested it had been empty for a while. The pillow settled back to its cool, neutral state, the linen unrumpled. Sloane was not in the room. From somewhere past the bedroom door, a thin, distant sound, the low pulse of a coffee machine, and then nothing. Alara sat with her knees drawn up and looked at the city through the glass, which was a different city now. Daylight city, actual city, the city where she had a workshop to open in 4 hours, and a 1922 ledger waiting in the pressing boards and 2 calls to return and a life that had been, until last night, comprehensively organized and entirely predictable. She found her dress. She found her jacket. She found her bag, her phone. 7 messages, the most recent 4 from Margot, escalating in urgency, and 1 shoe, and then the other shoe, which had ended up under the chair for reasons that made her feel briefly warm in a way she didn't examine. She was looking for her earrings when she saw the card. It was on the glass-top table beside the window, propped against a water glass, filled for her that she hadn't noticed. Small card, thick stock, the kind of paper that costs something. She picked it up. Sterling Investments. Below that, a phone number. Below that, in handwriting she recognized as Sloane's, precise and spare, the handwriting of someone who has edited themselves down to essentials, for whenever you want to be uncharacteristic again. Alara held the card. The city spread below her, 42 floors of it, everything she'd looked at from above, and now was going to descend back into. She felt the particular specific tenderness of a morning after a night that had mattered, and she felt also, not quite fear, but the adjacent thing. The awareness that you have opened a door and don't yet know what's on the other side. She put the card in her jacket pocket. She drank the water, which was cold, and tasted like being cared for in a small and practical way. Then she found her way out of the apartment that had a hallway she didn't remember, and an elevator that was very fast, and a lobby that was quiet at 6:45 a.m., except for the doorman who held the door for her without comment. And she walked out into October Manhattan, and stood on the sidewalk, and looked up at the building she'd just come down from. And stood there, in the gray-gold morning light, understanding that she was going to be thinking about this for a very long time. Her phone buzzed. Margot. Well? Alara put the phone in her pocket. She started walking. Around her, the city was already itself again. The vendors setting up, the early walkers with their dogs and their coffee, the buses making their procedural noise, the pigeons doing whatever it is pigeons do on autumn mornings. All of it ongoing, unhurried, magnificently indifferent to the fact that Alara Shaw had gone somewhere last night and returned as someone still herself, but enlarged by something she couldn't yet measure. She was 2 blocks away before she realized she was smiling. The card in her pocket said, Sterling Investments. She didn't know yet what that meant,